Elizabeth Short, also known as the Black Dahlia, is one of the most famous unsolved murder mysteries of all time. Intriguing and inspiring everyone from trashy tabloids to Joan Didion to James Ellroy to Patty Jenkins to Ryan Murphy of American Horror Story. Everyone wants to know who tortured and killed Elizabeth Short, cut her body into two, and left the pieces for the whole world to see. Who murdered the Black Dahlia? Me, I'd rather know Beth, the young woman behind the sensational nickname, who she was and how she lived. She's not just your murder muse. She was a real woman who deserved justice. 75 years ago, the cold and lifeless severed body of Elizabeth Short was dumped in a vacant lot in Los Angeles. She was found by a housewife walking with her daughter. The woman thought she was looking at pieces of a department store mannequin. The body was bisected with surgical precision, drained of blood, and disemboweled. The victim had multiple cuts, bruises, contusions, showing signs of torture, and her face was cut open from the corners of her mouth in what is called a Glasgow smile. The January 1947 murder of Elizabeth Short is a shocking unsolved crime, a defining case for the LAPD, and a haunted mystery that the public remains obsessed with more than 7 decades later. There are also multiple theories about who killed the woman known as the Black Dahlia. Was it a sex fiend with butchering skills? The famed doctor who knew Hollywood's sexual secrets? A thief and con man with mortuary experience? A disgruntled ex-lover? A surgeon suffering from dementia? Elizabeth was taken by someone possibly near the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles, kept for several days under horrifyingly savage conditions, beaten, tortured, killed, and then her body desecrated and dumped in a field. But I'm not going to talk about the case, the evidence, or the suspects here. It's not that I'm not intrigued with the mystery of Elizabeth Short's slaying, who done it, why, and how they got away with it. It's just that I'm way more interested in the victim's life. Who exactly was Elizabeth Short? Elizabeth Short was born July 29, 1924, in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts. Her father, Cleo, built miniature golf courses. Her mother, Phoebe Sawyer, grew up in Maine. Elizabeth was the third of 5 daughters born to the Short family. They were a middle-class Boston clan up until the 1929 stock market crash, when Cleo lost his job and his future prospects for supporting his family appeared slim. Sometime in 1930, Cleo disappeared. His car was found abandoned on the Charlestown Bridge, and police surmised that he had jumped into the river and killed himself. Phoebe, to support her family, then took up work as a bookkeeper and moved to a more modest home in Medford. Elizabeth was 5 or 6 years old at the time of her father's departure. Elizabeth was well liked at her high school, popular and known as a movie fan. During her teen years, Elizabeth, who intermittently used the nicknames Betty and Beth, developed bronchial problems and underwent lung surgery when she was 15. Still, she continued to suffer from asthma, and doctors told Phoebe that it was best that her daughter spend winters in a warmer, drier climate. So Phoebe sent Elizabeth to Florida to stay with family friends during the cold Boston winters. Elizabeth was in Florida several times during a 3-year period, dropping out of school during her sophomore year before returning to her mother's home. When she was 18 years old, the Short family received some stunning news. Father Cleo contacted them, very much alive. He admitted he had faked his death and was now living in Vallejo, California, and working at a naval shipyard. He sent Beth $200, and she traveled from Massachusetts to go live with her father. Beth arrived in Vallejo in December 1942. The arrangement with her dad lasted all of a month, with Cleo kicking his daughter out of the home in January after she began dating a boy with a criminal record. Beth then moved in with friends and got a job as a clerk at the Base Exchange Commissary at Camp Cook in Lompoc. While working and living near base, she met an Army Air Force sergeant, and the two began dating. But as she told friends, her boyfriend was physically abusive, and she broke up with him. In the summer of '43, she moved down to Santa Barbara and stayed with another friend who rented a small bungalow on West Montecito Street. Beth was only there 1 week when she was arrested at the nearby El Paseo Lounge for underage drinking. The arresting police officer, Mary Unkefer, made a connection with the now 19-year-old Short. Although Beth was no longer a minor, the court deemed her a juvenile delinquent and ordered her to return to her mother in Massachusetts. During the week between her arrest and her deportation, Beth stayed with Officer Unkefer, who remembered the young woman as very pretty, nicely dressed, and well-mannered. Years later, she told homicide detectives about Beth's tattoo, a rose, on her thigh. Beth did not remain in Massachusetts long. She departed shortly thereafter for Florida. Elizabeth spent most of 1944 to mid-1946 in Miami. It is believed that she stayed with the same family who housed her during her teens, but we are not sure. She got a job working at the Rosedale Delicatessen. In 1944, she met Air Force officer Matt Gordon. The two began dating and were soon engaged. Gordon was from Denver, Colorado, and a pilot in the renowned 2nd Air Commando Group, nicknamed the Flying Tigers. His P-40 plane was christened the Nipponese Nemesis. Unfortunately, Beth and Matt's engagement was short-lived after her fiancé was returned to active duty. He was killed near Calais, Kunda, India, on August 10, 1945. Beth was in shock and grief at the loss of Matt. She sometimes told acquaintances that she'd been pregnant at the time of his death and lost the baby. This was untrue. However, I can imagine that a grieving fiancé might fantasize that a part of her beloved was still alive inside of her. After Matt's death, Beth seemed lost and inconsolable, but she tried to rebound. She now had a type and began dating other soldiers and pilots returning from war. It was one of those military men, Army Air Force Lieutenant Joseph Gordon Fickling, that brought Elizabeth back to California. Beth moved to Long Beach in July 1946 in pursuit of Lieutenant Fickling, who was stationed at the Naval Reserve Air Base there. The two briefly spent time first in Chicago before continuing on to the West Coast. The film The Blue Dahlia, starring Alan Ladd and Veronica Lake, had recently been released, and it would inspire a new nickname for Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia. This was the name given to Beth by patrons of a local drugstore and cafe, thanks to her dark, attractive looks and the fact that she often wore a large flower tucked behind one or both ears. But the relationship with Fickling soon fizzled out, and Beth was left to find a new home. Thus began the last several months of her life, essentially a vagrant and couch surfer, who began serially dating men in order to have a meal and perhaps a little more. On August 3, 1946, Beth left Fickling's apartment in Long Beach and traveled by streetcar to Hollywood. She stayed for a week at a hotel on Sunset Boulevard and then began the snowball of desperation that led, ultimately, to her death just 5 months later. Elizabeth would stay with a friend for a night or two, and then she would get enough money to pay for a few days or even a week at a women's hotel, essentially boarding houses for young ladies. She never looked like a homeless person, always impeccably turned out with her black suits and pristine white blouses, ladylike gloves, and that elegant flower in her black hair. Her shoes and purse, however, were made of plastic, and years of neglecting her dental health had deteriorated her teeth to the point of rot. Beth frequented the bars, nightclubs, and restaurants of Hollywood, searching for men to support her. She would position herself at the bar, flip open her slit skirt to reveal the rose tattoo on her thigh, and wait for someone to buy her a drink, always a club soda. Then she would accept their invitation to dinner and get a hearty meal in her. Some of these men she dated heard her sob story about her lost fiancé and her miscarried baby and her deadbeat father and her erstwhile roommates and hotel staff who were hassling her for money, and they would help her out, give her a 10 spot, maybe a little more. A few of her girlfriends during this time later claimed that Beth was hoping to make it as an actress. However, she never went on a single audition. She'd never even been in a school play. It was all an illusion, a holograph of a life, hungry and homeless and hankering for something more than what she had. And then in late 1946, she met the acquaintance of Mark Hansen, owner of the Florentine Club. Hansen, who was Danish, had come to some prominence in the Los Angeles scene of that era. 33 years older than Beth and married but separated from his wife, he was known to be attracted to young women and offered many of them jobs in his nightclub, and some he even invited to stay at his home. According to his friend, actress Ann Toth, Beth was one of the girls who came to stay. Beth was at Mark Hansen's home during October and November 1946. During that time, she inquired about an address book with Mark's name embossed on it. Mark gave her the book, which later was sent to police after her death. Several pages were torn out of the book. Perhaps Mark had used the book before passing it on to Elizabeth and ripped out the pages that had his contacts. Or perhaps the killer tore out pages with incriminating information. After an altercation with another girl staying at Hansen's, Beth departed in mid-November. She went to stay at the Chancellor, an historic apartment building on Wilshire, in a shared room with several other girls. She later told Ann Toth that she didn't want to remain there, that there was bad company at the Chancellor. Beth was particularly concerned that 2 of the girls were using marijuana and worried that police would raid their shared apartment. She was still playing the dating game, fielding phone calls from her many suitors and sometimes playing them against each other. By December, she was ready to move on. Early that month, she got on a Greyhound bus and rode to San Diego. Days after arriving in San Diego, Beth was found sleeping in a movie theater during an evening show. The young woman working at the Aztec, 22-year-old Dorothy French, woke Elizabeth and felt bad for the young woman. She seemed shy, somewhat dejected, and a little mysterious. French invited Short to come and stay with her family. Beth spent nearly a month with the French family in San Diego. During that time, she never had a job, seemed frightened when anyone came to the door, and her only contribution to the household was light cleaning duties. Once, her former beau, Lieutenant Fickling, wired her $100, which she gave to the Frenches. She continued to go out at night to meet men, and it was one of those men she left the Frenches' home with on January 8, 1947, when her host family asked her to please depart. Red Manley was a married, red-headed salesman who basically was using Elizabeth to see if he wanted to stay with his wife and new baby or leave them. He figured if he and Beth did not have sex, it would prove that he still loved his wife. When he picked Beth up from the Frenches, they went to stay at a hotel near the coast. Nothing sexual happened. Beth was not feeling well. She claimed she was having her period. The next morning, she told him that she wanted to return to Los Angeles, and he agreed to drive her in his Studebaker. During their drive north, Manley noticed several scratches on Beth's arms and listened as she talked about a jealous boyfriend, an Italian, back in San Diego. But he had caught her in several other lies that week and doubted her story. Once in Los Angeles, Beth told Red that she needed to check her luggage at the bus depot. Back in those days, you could spend a nickel renting a locker for several days. If you were transient and didn't want to carry your suitcase around while you looked for the next place to stay, this was a good proposition. Certainly safer than leaving it with a friend who may not be trustworthy. At the depot, Beth got out of the car and waved goodbye, but Red told her he didn't feel comfortable leaving her in such an unsafe neighborhood. To get rid of Manley, Beth lied. She said she had received a telegram from her sister, who asked to meet her at the Biltmore Hotel. Her sister actually lived up north in Oakland, but Red didn't know that. He gave Beth one more ride to Pershing Square and the Biltmore. Again, Elizabeth tried to send Red off, and again he refused. He had, after all, invested quite a bit in this potential relationship. Hotels, gas money, meals. He even paid for Beth's shoes to be re-heeled and towed. He still wondered if she might be the girl to help him decide to leave his wife and kid. They spent about 2 hours at the Biltmore Lounge, and finally Red agreed to leave. He departed at 6:30 p.m. on Thursday, January 9th, 1947. The hotel staff reported that after he departed, they saw Beth leave the Biltmore, walking south down Olive Street, perhaps to the Crown Grill. The Crown was one of many places in the city where Elizabeth would pick up dates. Beth was not confirmed seen by anyone she knew for the next 7 days, and on the 8th day, Friday, January 17th, 1947, her body was discovered, mutilated, dumped in a field, desecrated, and drained of blood. There were ligature marks on her wrists and ankles, indicating she had been bound, and marks across her neck. 2 pieces of flesh had been excised from her body, a section of her breast and the rose tattoo. The coroner later found the flesh with the tattoo stuffed into the victim's vaginal cavity. There were lacerations on her arms and chest, and wounds on her head from what appeared to be a bludgeoning. There were 2 deep cuts made on either side of her mouth, the Glasgow smile, and her body had been severed in 2 between the 2nd and 3rd lumbar vertebrae, a surgical procedure known as a hemicorporectomy. The contents of her stomach were tinged with a greenish color, possibly indicating that she had been forced to eat her own feces or the feces of another human or animal or fertilizer. And there were signs she may have been raped. Days later, someone mailed a package to the LAPD. It contained Beth's birth certificate, some photos and business cards, a few names written on pieces of paper, and Mark Hansen's address book with several pages removed. The packet had been cleaned with gasoline. Police were able to pick up prints, however, and they were sent to the FBI for testing, but were compromised during mailing and not tested. The same day the envelope was received by LAPD, someone found Beth's purse and one of her shoes near a dumpster 2 miles from where her body was discovered. They had also been cleaned with gasoline, and no fingerprints were detected. Some of the women who knew Elizabeth Short were questioned by police after her murder. Police interrogated Mark Hansen, Red Manley, and several other men associated with Elizabeth Short, but were never able to pin the murder on anyone. It remains a cold case 75 years later. It is hard to imagine anyone inflicting this much pain and torture on a human being without there being a reason. Did she pick up a man on January 9th, intending to fleece yet another dinner and some money for a hotel out of them, and encounter someone much more dangerous than she'd ever met? Did she contact an old boyfriend and not deliver on sex? Did she cross paths with someone deranged enough to want to take it out on her, perhaps as a representative of all women? We cannot know what the reasons were for keeping Beth for 7 days, torturing her, killing her, desecrating her body, and dumping it in a public field. And we will never know who killed Elizabeth Short. But there are things we do know, and things we can debunk about the woman known as the Black Dahlia. Elizabeth Short was not a prostitute or a call girl. Elizabeth Short was not an actress or a failed actress or a wannabe actress. She never even applied to be an extra. Elizabeth Short was not sexually infantile and incapable of intercourse. Elizabeth Short was not pregnant at the time of her disappearance and death. Elizabeth Short was not an alcoholic. Elizabeth Short was not a lesbian. Elizabeth Short was not a man-hater. Elizabeth Short was not at the Cecil Hotel before she disappeared. And most importantly, Elizabeth Short did not deserve what happened to her, including the media's many efforts to besmirch her in death and law enforcement's failure to find and prosecute her killer. Lastly, while the search by armchair detectives about who killed the Black Dahlia will continue for years to come, I believe that Elizabeth Short deserves to be at peace. We cannot solve her murder. We cannot find justice for her. We cannot know the full truth. We cannot save Beth. And Beth is much more than the Black Dahlia, your murder muse.
She does not belong to you. She is not your victim. She was never a whore. She was just a girl. She wasn't trash to be thrown away. She was waiting for her prince to come. She's still waiting for her prince to come. She does not belong to you. She is not your victim. She was never a whore. She was just a girl. She wasn't